I'm Monica Johnson with Marshall Weber, and this is Booklyn Calling. Hello, welcome to our show where we talk about artists, libraries, and social justice. Marshall and I are both artists who head up Booklyn Inc., an arts nonprofit located in Brooklyn, New York, on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape people. We created Booklyn Calling to amplify the voices within the artist book field, but also to explore art making as a tool for community engagement and for social change. And so today, our guest is Zoe Beloff. Zoe grew up in Edinburgh, Scotland, and moved to New York City in 1980 to study at Columbia University. She is a super prolific multimedia artist. She's a filmmaker, a writer, a painter, illustrator, muralist, and so much more that we'll learn as we talk with her, I'm sure. Most recently, Booklyn distributed two of Zoe's books. One is called The Parade of the Old New. It's an accordion fold book that reproduced an epic panoramic painting that was done on cardboard. And the second book is Reminiscences of a Refugee Childhood that she created along with her mother, Zoe Beloff. And it's the story of her mother's childhood. And then previous to that, in 2019, Booklyn published an archival box set of Zoe's works in the print and book formats. Before we welcome Zoe directly into the show, I just wanted to say a few lines about why we're doing the show, just to lay the groundwork for our conversation. One of the reasons is just to give ourselves the opportunity to slow down and have the conversations that aren't necessarily always documented within the work and aren't always the language that we use to describe the work or are found within bios, but there's something a little bit more fluid and building that we can find out through conversations when we're in community with each other.
I just wanted to also note that Zoe's work is really resonant in terms of New York City culture and bibliophilic culture. Her books are really beautiful and engaging, and I'm excited to just dive into the conversation.
Me too. I have so many questions. But for now, let's welcome Zoe. Can you say hello and tell me if I got anything wrong or if you wanted to add anything to how we're introducing you?
I don't think so. Here I am. I'm up for anything.
I love it so much. Okay, well, the place we wanted to dive into was, can we explore for a little bit, like the conditions around the Parade of the Old New as what we know of it now as the mural that was made on cardboard. And if you can talk a little bit about like how that developed and in what stages it developed, and yeah, let us know where it is now and all of it.
Well, as of today, I think the actual mural, I just got an email, is stuck in Paris in transit between Augsburg, Germany, and hopefully back in New York soon. But it's had some kind of wild adventures, and it really started in started in 2007, January 2017. So with the inauguration of President Trump, and at that time, I was, as many of us was totally enraged, and we were painting protest posters, and we going on marches, and we were going to the Women's March, and we were doing all these things. And I was painting my placards to take on these marches on corrugated cardboard. And I just didn't feel they were big enough to express my rage. You know, they just, even though they were really big for one person to carry, they did not possibly contain what I really wanted to say. So my first impetus was I need a bigger canvas. So I launched into this thing, which I honestly have never done before, and maybe I hope I will never do again, which is create what's called a history painting. But I decided to do it on cardboard because, to me, cardboard is an incredibly important medium of the 21st century. It's not only like what people take on protests, but it's also the medium of global shipping. It's like the medium of last resort when you're homeless. People build little shelters out of cardboard. Cardboard, as I say, is everywhere. And so I think it was the right medium. So I decided I would paint this epic history painting on cardboard. So I went and I started with cardboard panels, just standard cardboard panels you can buy in an art supply shop, which is 40 by 60 inches. So it was 60 inches high. And panels work for a couple of different reasons. One is my studio is small, so I could realistically only paint two at once. And secondly, I didn't know what was going to happen. And this, I had a bad feeling, was just the beginning. So it's called The Parade of the Old New because that's the title of a poem that Bertolt Brecht wrote in 1938, another really, really bad time. In the poem, he imagines like this new leader who commands a triumphal procession to the capital, and he and his henchmen are all shouting, "It's new, we're new, everything is new." But if you could really see him as he was, it was the most worst, disgusting old ideas that had come back repackaged as the new. And I felt that really spoke to America first. And that's kind of what we were seeing at this very moment as it was happening. So that's why I decided to call this work Parade of the Old New. And I think that first January, I painted 6 panels, and which was the procession to the Capitol and what lay in its wake, the Mexican border wall that meets at a vanishing point with the Japanese internment camp. So I was very interested in these old ideas that come back again. And I paused because I didn't know what was going to happen next. And then over the next, off and on, I mean, it wasn't continuous, over the next 4 years, I found myself every few months, I had to pick up and start more panels. I just felt like I had this obligation to speak about this time and make a record of the time. And it's monsters. If you see the painting, it's done in an allegorical style. So there are creatures that have bodies of men but heads of animals, for example, or vice versa. I mean, I was very much thinking of the great mural paintings and frescoes. So kind of like my starting point was this allegory that was painted in the town hall of Siena. You can still see it in the 1400s, and it was called The Allegory of Good and Bad Government. And I felt like mine was an allegory of bad government, and somebody should keep a record. So I think of it as really a form of record keeping. And as I say, I did it off and on for 4 years. I decided I would go on until the election, and when Trump was voted out of office, then it would end. And so it got longer than I expected. The actual mural, it's a series now of 40 cardboard panels, and I think it's 135 feet long. end to end. I actually thought I was ending with this vision of Black Lives Matter painting, those great paintings on roads that said Black Lives Matter. And that was kind of a new road ahead after the George Floyd protests. And I was going to end it there with kind of this hope of a new direction. And then you won't believe it, but January 6th happened. And I was like, shit. Oh no, shit, I have to go and buy more cardboard. So I felt like such a horrifying yet like important thing. I couldn't just pretend it didn't happen. So, that becomes like this vermin, like dive bombing the Capitol. And it actually ends with an image of Amanda Gorman reading her poem. Because I still wanted like this other direction, this other road ahead. And so I painted this crazy thing, like what was to become of it? Maybe that's a lead into talking about making a book.
Yeah, before we do, I just want to give some measurements to the size of your anger as manifested in the mural. So these panels were 40 by 60 inches. So 60 inches being the vertical height. And then once you multiply that by the 40 panels, it ends up being 130 feet. Is that correct?
Something like that, yes.
Okay. Yeah. So, and then I wanted to ask too, like, so as you were showing up to protests, the marches and everything that was happening throughout this year's span of awfulness, were you also painting signs and then bringing them out in the street and then either leaving them or sharing them or bringing them home? Or were some of them kind of modeling what you would put into the murals that you were, I think, mostly painting in your studio, correct?
Yeah. Oh, yes. As I went out to marches, I always made sure to paint my protest posters because I feel like it's not just about anger, but it's also about just anger is bitterness. And that's a terrible emotion. We must have a festive protest, a protest that celebrates who we are and our visual language and makes everybody want to join us because we're just like, we have the best, most beautiful, cool visual thing, I love it. I would love to go and see what everybody was doing. But they also are a grab for the media. So they had a function and they were like split off parts of my big painting. It was like pieces of that. I mean, not literally, but, they were in the same style and they were just manageable to carry. And they're just great because everybody wants a phone picture with them. So they were kind of a phone camera magnet and people would pass them around to have their picture taken. And they got in some media and newspapers and TV. And so, it's a celebration also of who we are. And that's why they should not be painted with bitterness. That they're not grotesque in that way or dark and depressing. They're very brightly colored and in a certain way, very festive.
So with that style in mind, there were two kind of art historical references that I wanted to ask you about. One was Thomas Hart Benton, and the other was Art Spiegelman. And so
wow, that's
crossroads.
Whoa.
It's a little bit of distance, but it came to mind when you were talking about Benton being like a populist, right? Who made like $5 knockoffs of his murals and paintings, and Spiegelman being most well known for his use of animal characters with his narratives. So I'm just interested if are these influences? Is this just the ambiance of the kind of metaphorical world of popular painting?
That's interesting. I mean, obviously, I know their work. Spielberg in particular, this idea of humans as animals. But actually, at the beginning, I was really looking at John Hartfield montages, where he does a number of things with humans with animal faces. Sergei Eisenstein in Strike does that. The muralists that I think I really was more interested in was Ben Shahn, Diego Rivera, Victor Anatov, which are actually calm. They're not like where I think of Thomas Hart Benton. It's very mannerist. It's super kind of wild in a certain way, whereas the muralists I liked are actually quite matter of fact. But I wanted to bring their work more into the 21st century. So there is an element in mine that they're brightly colored. There's speech bubbles. It also draws from like the graphic novel. Absolutely. When I was painting this, I had the mistaken idea that I could show this work in its entirety in America. I mean, because it was for America. It's about America. And I thought it would find a place where it could be exhibited, which has totally not happened. Although it has been.
Do you have any speculation of why?
I think here there's just this feeling of like, why go to this dark place? Something that might upset somebody. You never know.
Yeah.
Better safe than sorry. Yeah. I feel like there's just like, let's not rock the boat. Yeah. I mean, to me, I would like what's important to me, if it was up to me, would be to find some place that would archive it. Because I think it's a record of a time. And as such, it belongs to the future.
Mm-hmm.
But the book is...
I mean, just to say, I think that you're on to something in terms of, not wanting to rock the boat with the imagery. I'm just taking a few glances at the inside of the book, which, of course, is the representation of the actual paintings that would be exhibited. And there's Klan hoods, there's Confederate flags, there's weapons, there's, ICE agents with German Shepherd head. There's a lot of things that I can see there being a reason to not want to even delve into the complexity of what the public response would be to these very divisive issues that we've already seen, so profoundly in the last handful of years with the American public.
Well, I think also the stylistic issue. I mean, if you look at the muralists you mentioned, and it's not like they were exceedingly well received in the United States either.
No.
Thinking about Rivera's mural being destroyed by Rockefeller. But I think aside from kind of the vocabulary and vernacular of nascent decolonization or radical or socialist politics in this country, I find that the art world is really resistant to actually non-fluffy historical critique as a style. I mean, it's interesting that on one hand you describe the work as being still and calm, and in part you're talking about kind of the appearance of the aesthetic of the actual painting, right? The composition. But the work is, the small accordion fold book is very challenging. To be confronted with a larger installation work that brings up all those issues in a very graphic manner is very challenging now. I mean, people were very challenged by Mouse when Spiegelman first published it.
Actually, they're still challenged by Mouse.
Yeah,
that's right.
It's now on all those banned book lists right now.
It's another banned bestseller. But it's also countered by the fact that, lots of people on the Booklyn circuit were very intrigued by the book. And there's some precedents for it that I think I see in your Between Worlds project.
That's true. That was absolutely a parallel project and designed to be a parallel project. I mean, there were really three projects that I did during that 4 years that Trump was in power. And I did them feeling that they spoke to each other and to different facets of the experience that we were going through. So there was this kind of grand history painting that was Parade of the Old New.
Well, let me pause real quick and just sort of introduce Between Worlds a little bit, and then Zoe, you can round it out with other details. But it's a risograph printed book. It's, let's see, I'm looking at some statistics. It was published in 2018. It was done during a residency in the Netherlands, and such that the measurements are not in the convenient inches of a U.S. risograph machine, but I think it's sort of like 11 by 17 or something, and you can fill that in. It's full color, maybe it's like 5 colors, and it's a documentary story about an asylum seeker in the United States from Cameroon who you befriended through actually some relationship. I would love for you to talk about how that relationship developed and where it is now.
Yeah. So if Parade of the Old New is considered like the grand sweep of history, I also wanted to show how what was happening in the United States impacted a real person, like the body of an individual, like how this immigration policy played out in the real world on a person. So from the general to the absolutely specific. And it was I also felt like it wasn't enough just to go on some marches and this and that and, hold up some banners, but you actually had to do something practical. And my first thought for something practical I wanted to do was, if I could, work with or help refugees. Because, and we can talk about this later, I come from a refugee family. So I really didn't know how to begin. I didn't have connections. Somehow I hooked up with Hayes, which is a Jewish charity that works with asylum seekers and refugees. And they had a program where you could write to people, refugees and asylum seekers who were incarcerated in immigration detention centers. And then somebody from that group said, I want to arrange something where we actually go and see people. So I belonged to this small group of Jewish women, and we teamed up with First Friends of New Jersey and New York, which has a charity that has very specific links with detention centers in New Jersey, and they help the people who are incarcerated, and they facilitated these visits. So we would go once every 2 weeks. I would go with my partner, and we would talk with somebody in the immigration detention center who didn't have any visitors. I mean, you have to understand, many people there have tons of visitors because they'd been arrested from their homes in Queens, and thrown in an immigration detention center. So their children, their wives, whatever, would come and see them. But there were people, particularly from Africa, who had nobody. So we just went to visit them, and you just talk, you sit for an hour, and it's like in a prison place, and you talk with them. And I learned a lot, and I got to know people. And with this one person who fortunately did eventually get asylum, because, you talk with people over many months. I wanted to tell his story. And it was very clear to me that the story would have to be in book form, because it was not something you could photograph or film. So that I wanted to do it. It was clear it had to be a book, and that was a way I could share that story.
It's a really beautiful, heartfelt piece, and it's interesting. I wanted to ask you, your books have a very cinematic feel, And I think that's interesting when people are working in multidisciplinary ways to see kind of the techniques of cinema that you apply in some of your books. Like there's a beautiful scene in Between Worlds where it's above and below water. Um, and just is this conscious? Is this intentional? I mean, how do you see the relationship between the various media that you work in? And maybe, from my perspective, I'm interested in how that applies to the book as a serial narrative or serial media.
I mean, to me, picture books, or whether a graphic novel or a picture book, is really similar to me to making a film. They're both forms of storytelling, and they both have duration. And when I'm making a film, like a narrative film, I storyboard it all. Like I draw it first, and then it goes to the next level of actually filming. But, I draw, we take like tons of location photographs. Sometimes I'm like in our last film, I had a set. So I was like painting the set, which is like making a painting. There's so much that connect the two. And it just, for some things, you want to film them. Other things, particularly these 2 books I made about refugees, because it was impossible to film, I decided to draw as well. People can tell you things and tell you stories, and then I can find a visual through drawing. I can make them come alive. I mean, with the asylum seeker, obviously he was around, so I could like he was my model, but he also had little snapshots from his phone of where he grew up and his home. And he would tell me about what the detention center looked like inside, because, I could never get beyond the visiting room. And even in the visiting room, you can't even bring a pencil stub in there. But with words, that can help me put things into pictures.
Yeah, it's very interesting because the cover of your book, Reminiscence of Refugee Childhood, has a photograph set inside a drawing. So it almost exemplifies what you're talking about. It seems like a theme through your work.
Yeah, that book was really interesting. That's a book about my mother's childhood and my grandparents, and who they had to they managed to escape Nazi Germany in 1939. There were many, really hundreds of tiny snapshots that my grandparents had taken, and they were really wonderful and beautiful, and I wanted to share them, and they were very much an impetus part of why I wanted to make that book. But snapshots are interesting because people take snapshots for happy reasons, to celebrate things, even if it just be every day of going to the park or having coffee or going to the beach, or in those days of my grandparents, going to the photographer's studio was a thing that you did. So the dark times, the Nazi rallies where they had to, run and hide, Kristallnacht, where my mother's school was burned down. There's no record of, there's no pictures of that. And then in the Second World War, my grandparents and my mother were in England. You couldn't take photographs. There was no film. Like that was all requisitioned by the government. So there's huge gaps, visual gaps. And I was trying to find a way to suggest things and that I had never seen, and that worked in dialogue with photographs. And for me, visually, that was actually quite challenging. How could I make a drawing and a photograph work together and talk to each other on the same page? I mean, that was just a art challenge. So they belong to the same world.
Yeah. Right.
Could you talk a little bit about, in your practice as an interdisciplinary artist, when things need to be a book? And you've laid out that Between Worlds had to be a book because of the restrictions against photography and filming. But has it ever been the case that something needed to be a book, not for those particular reasons? I think there's maybe, I want to say there's like 6 or 7 books at least that I'm aware of in your repertoire.
Like the Coney Island book about the Coney Island Amateur Psychoanalytic Society.
Yeah.
That's a good example of something that was actually an exhibition and then it became a book. I think oftentimes I'm drawn to doing a book. Well, partly I love books. I like them as objects. I like the fact that they're quite affordable. It's not like fine art that's just for people with lots of money. Like, I can give books to people. Books are not overly expensive. Books are fun to have. But also books can have a different discourse than, say, pictures on a wall. And a lot of my artwork is also about thinking about ideas and histories and so on that can be fleshed out in written form. In more like books, you can have writing and pictures. And sometimes I feel like there are backstories that I want to tell that books are really suited to doing. So a kind of discursiveness you can have in books that you might not have in an art show of your work.
Well, I just wanted to say that I wonder if, you were saying that the books can provide a sort of, affordable, I don't know if you said portable, but it is more private as a medium than maybe viewing something in an exhibition. And I wonder if that's, I don't know if it's fair to say this, but in my thinking, the book Parade of the Old New was much more, well received by the people, like in its format as a book, than maybe it was received as like a potential exhibition. And maybe that's part of it. You can close the book, it's not as bold and provocative in a static way in the ways that we've already discussed.
Well,
but you can close it. You can put it on the shelf.
True. That's really interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. I always thought it's because you distributed it. And so many people could make a decision themselves whether they wanted it, rather than some gatekeeper. And the gatekeeper is second guessing everybody else. That's what they're doing. And that's what makes them nervous, because it might reflect badly on them. And they could get into trouble, or somebody could be unhappy. And whereas a book, people make their own decisions. They can look at it and decide for themselves about how they feel about it. So I think that's really important. But you were also wonderful to just jump in and take it. And that was really great.
I wanted to bring up a point involved with that, in that whole situation of the gatekeepers and what can happen in the private sector, what can happen in our homes. Because I think that if you have a big, giant painting series, obviously you are depending on institutional space, and institutional space always has gatekeepers, and the tendency in those spaces is to be conservative. Whereas if, for instance, you have a popular book that can be bought fairly inexpensively and seen in your own home, there are no gatekeepers. It's anyone's choice. Obviously, the work was more popular than the gatekeepers' decisions might evidence. But I also wanted to mention that's where kind of the libraries come in as this interesting space in between, the gatekeepers of the art institutions and the public realm. Because a lot of the libraries, for instance, that Booklyn is dealing with are public libraries or state university libraries. And you have a certain kind of gatekeeper there whose interests are more inclusive than exclusive. And so I think it's interesting how many institutional libraries who wouldn't necessarily have the space to exhibit the paintings could have the same motivation and intention to acquire the book and amplify it by sharing it with many other people who have access to that library, but also use the accordion fold in a display in, the smaller exhibition spaces that most, university libraries have, or most public libraries have these days. So it's interesting that there's a few different places where the work can be, distributed to and exhibited and accessed. And we kind of don't need to rely on those big institutional gatekeepers to, give their okay or their thumbs up.
No, I agree. And I'm actually very happy that a lot of my books are in libraries. I think that's really wonderful, and it's a place that they should be, and it's where they can kind of live on. And yeah, I'm really happy about that. I just actually talked to a friend of mine today I'm going to see shortly, who has an artist bookstore in London, and she just sold the last two of my books, Parade and the Refugee Book, to the British Library. And I'm really happy. I mean, I want my mother's story and my grandparents' story to live on in archives, and that's partly why I created it. And it has been doing that to a certain extent. And yeah, I think that's really good, because it is a place where things can live on and they can be shared.
Yes. I had to laugh when you talked about your friend who didn't want to spend the rest of her life selling art to rich people, because I think that is the motivation of so many people who come to work at Booklyn, who are artists who are just fed up with the narco-trafficante money laundry of the art world and are looking for more public or state or community or any kind of way to get art out into the public realm. Because I think one of the things you said was you liked the nature of the book as a serial medium that had a more discursive element. Like there's more space in a book to be intimate, to be vulnerable. And I think that's an appealing medium. And that medium in of itself is kind of a little bit antithetical to the spectacle of Miami, Basel, or, whatever.
Zoe, I wanted to talk to you a little bit or ask you about what your days are like. To me, you don't strike me as somebody who doesn't have time to sit and chit chat, because we have a very enjoyable, what I feel is like a leisurely conversation about how things are going. But yeah, I just appreciate how much work you create and put out and that I can see. And I just wondered what your life is like. How do you feel like your life supports your ability to do that? And do you feel that way about yourself?
Wow. I just do things that I feel like that interest me in the world. I feel very fortunate that I have a job that pays the bills that I think is actually worth doing. Which is, teaching young people who, from working class backgrounds, immigrants and whatever, which make up City University. And that I can get paid for that is really great, even though I sometimes come home exhausted. And I've, I certainly paid my dues as an adjunct teacher. So I feel like I'm lucky to be able to do that so I can do other things that are exciting to me. But I just I'm not fancy. When I had this show in Paris, they were just shocked to know that I didn't have a real studio. Me and my husband, we live in a 2-bedroom apartment, and the bedrooms are our studios, and we sleep in the living room. We don't have
Nice.
a real studio. No, I can't afford a real studio. I'm not that kind of artist, I feel lucky that I get to, I don't make any money with the artwork I do. It's not really about that, but I get to meet all kinds of people. I get to travel. I feel very lucky that I go to Europe kind of often, because in a lot of ways even though I've lived here since 1980, I actually feel somewhat more European. I feel like I like spending time in Europe. I think if I was a young person now, I probably would go to Europe and I wouldn't go to America. But that was New York was a different place in 1980. It was considerably cheaper.
It's interesting. There used to be an old joke that I don't hear anymore, but people would say that they'd say, "Oh, New York, it's the biggest European city in the United States."
Oh, I think it's totally true, actually. It's the closest you can be a European and walk everywhere and all that kind of stuff, and eat European food because somebody's eating it, that without actually being in Europe. It's totally true.
I wanted to ask you a question along the lines of Monica's, but a little bit more topical. And you're speaking about these issues about being, issues of immigration and migration and refugees, which a lot of your work addresses those issues. And you are indeed, personally, you've emigrated to the United States and speaking about how you still have some of that European identity, which there would be no reason for that to dissipate in New York City. But I'm just wondering if you could speak more to, your personal identity as someone with multiple kind of cultures and having a family that's been both refugees and immigrants, and how this all kind of manifests in your personal life and in your work.
That's an interesting question, and it's a question I've come increasingly to reflect on. Because as a child, I grew up in Scotland, but I felt like totally alienated because, I'm Jewish, and I think I was the only Jewish child in my whole school. And you definitely, if you don't have not lived in Scotland for generations, you are not Scottish, you will never be Scottish, and you will never really belong. And I think as a child, I was very conscious of that. This was not my world. And I didn't really know my parents are not religious. So we're like Jewish, but we're not religious. So it wasn't like that. But I think I knew it was like I was the only Jew because my mother had a line in the sand. I was not to go to Christmas or Easter, what's it called? Service at the school where a minister came to address the children. She felt that was, even though we weren't religious, that was just a bridge too far. So, and people would make remarks, and why wasn't I there? And so I just never felt like this was, even when I was in college, I went to art school there, it was clear I'd never be a Scottish artist. This was not my world. And so I just wanted to get the hell out of there. And New York, you could be in New York for 3 weeks and you're a New Yorker, I just felt immediately much more at home. So that was really nice. It just came into everybody's from somewhere else here.
That makes so much sense. I think when we first met, or around we were kind of getting to know each other, and you had you let me borrow some vintage children's books to put in our exhibition, Little Radicals, which was an exhibition at Booklyn. And I think at some point I may have introduced you, not formally, she was born in Scotland, or I made some reference to having had a Scottish upbringing. And there are a lot of people around, so I kind of noticed a little, not an eye roll, but kind of you didn't engage with that identity, and we're sort of communicating that in a really very casual, non-aggressive way. But I imagine that's probably what you were feeling, is sure, that's where I was born and raised, but to carry that with me into social communities is an awkward way to represent myself. Is that something
that's
what was happening?
Absolutely true. That's absolutely true. People always think, oh, you grew up there, you're Scottish. And when I grew up, I was so not Scottish. that it was like this really like saw point, I think, that like suddenly you go somewhere else and you are thought to belong to a place that would never have you. It's just weird. That's why, on my website, I call myself a rootless cosmopolitan, which is like what Stalin called the Jews. You couldn't trust them because they didn't really belong to the land. And I think that's a good thing. I'll just briefly mention what I'm working on now because it kind of grows out of Parade.
Good. I'm glad. I was going to ask.
So I'm doing a project now. I'm called The Song of the Essential Worker, which is film interviews, and it will be posters and a mural with a really diverse, wonderful array of different kinds of workers. So I'm actually really enjoying this. It's become, of course, everything I do, it always becomes bigger than I'd imagined it would be and harder than I'd imagined. But you'll be finding out more, especially when the poster project gets really underway. As yet, it's a website, theworkerswall.com, and you can find these whole array of like little short portrait films that we've been working on this fall and this spring. So check it out. There will be more.
And with that, I'm going to say thank you.
And thank you guys. And, Monica, thank you for taking and distributing my books and finding good homes for them. And it really means the world to me.
It is our pleasure, Zoe. Thank you so much for the time you've taken and for sharing everything. And and thank you to everyone listening for joining for this episode of Booklyn Calling. You can check out the show notes for ways to connect with Zoe Beloff. And there's tons of stuff we laid out. So we'll just be sure to put, a bunch of links so you can find the stuff that we're referencing. And, I don't normally do this, but I am going to plug your website, Zoe, just because I think it's it's kind of a wonderland of things. Not only is it just like lots of multimedia, but you can actually watch films within the website. I'm not sure if that's true of everything, but like there's definitely a lot of watchable films that are gorgeous. And the last thing I'll say is that if you're listening and you're a librarian or a curator at an educational institute and you're interested in collecting Zoe's work or other works like it, you can always email us at hello@booklyn.org, or you can see our entire collection at booklyn.org. And with that, I will say thank you and goodbye.
Well, it was great. A pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah. Thank you, Zoe.
Bye, Zoe. This podcast was made possible in part by funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs and in partnership with the City Council, and from individual donors to Booklyn Inc. You can support this podcast by making a donation at booklyn.org/donate.